Thank you, guys. I'd just like to firstly take the opportunity to thank the entire ABC team for putting on this event. I think you've done an absolutely fantastic job. So just as a big thank you, I'm sure on behalf of everybody here, so cheers. I'm Jonathan Growcott. I'm a PhD student from the University of Exeter. I'm also a member of the Wildlife Conservation and Research Unit at the University of Oxford. I'm a conservation technologist, whatever that is really. Yeah, I know, right? And a big cat biologist. Hence, the name of my talk being The Secret Acoustic World of Leopards, Vocal Individuality in Leopards and its Potential for Conservation Monitoring. So let's dive into this. What exactly are we talking about here? Well, maybe it's better to start with what monitoring, or maybe even monitoring what. So why leopards? Well, according to the IUCN status, they are vulnerable. Their populations are declining, and they're actually only inhabiting an absolutely tiny amount of space that their historic range would once suggest. On top of that, they're nocturnal, they're cryptic, they're a solitary species, which means they're quite a bit of a pain to actually monitor. However, as a top predator, they're really crucial. They play a crucial part in the ecosystem, and they're also quite a big draw for ecotourism. So they both contain both economic and ecological importance. But how do we monitor them? How can we be sure that their populations are declining, and how can we potentially be stopping that? Well, at the moment, camera traps are the big thing. Beyond that, we use spore surveys, so we look for scats and tracks. If you want more fine-scale behavioral information, you may do on-collar work, you may focus on GPS or accelerometry data. What about bioacoustics? Why have we not potentially considered integrating bioacoustics into large carnivore monitoring? So that's potentially the focus of this work. Now, before I move on, I'd like to do a show of hands. I know it's late in the day, it's the last session. Put your hands up if you've heard of audio moths. Put your hands up if you've heard of song meters. Put your hands up if you've heard of caracals. Oh, that's better than I thought, actually. And we're not just on about the small cats. So, there you go. Yeah. Well, there is another passive acoustic monitoring tool that you may be interested in, called caracals. These are a fully open source, well, you have to build them yourselves, like here, with an elephant watching on. They're a PCB board which housed in a plastic enclosure, which has 4 microphones, which allows for quadraphonic audio recording. They also, as modeled by the cockroach here, have a GPS unit, which means that if you have an array, you have time-synchronized data, which is really important if you're wanting to do stuff like localization, potentially. And you would install them maybe halfway up a tree. And in honor of what Simon was saying, that we need more of these sort of iconic shots, I thought it'd be rude not to include that one. The bandana wasn't a fashion choice. It was necessary to keep my sunglasses on. It didn't stop me being called Rambo. So whereabouts was I doing this work? Where was I integrating bioacoustics into large carnivore monitoring? Well, in South Tanzania, in Nyeri National Park. Anyone who knows Tanzanian national parks knows that Nyeri is massive, so we need to zoom in a little bit further. Specifically, if we see the northeastern section here. Here we ran the first large-scale paired camera trap and bioacoustic survey for large carnivore monitoring. So the black triangles are where we had paired camera traps and an ARU station. And we had 50 of these, which covered about 350 square kilometers. So quite a heavy grid. Data was being recorded continuously across a 60-day period, which meant that we got actually about 75,000 hours worth of data. Yeah, I know. So I've talked to you about the species that I'm monitoring, or the species that's the basis of this talk. We talked about the tech and where that this work was conducted. What actually am I on about? What about here is deaf leopards, or deafening leopards. And some of you may be going, hang on, I didn't even know leopards roar. And that's fair. Alongside lions and tigers, they are the third big cat species which actually do roar. But what's the application of this? What might we want to use leopard roars for? Well, as we talked about before, they're a solitary nocturnal species which is quite hard to monitor. Bioacoustics, as we know, enables us to get a larger detection range. So maybe this is something that we can make use of. And a really basic bioacoustics question is a species unique? Does it produce unique vocalizations? And heuristically and anecdotally, through indigenous knowledge, leopards are thought to. And alongside that, in the other large carnivore scene, lions have unique roars, wild dogs have unique who calls, and spotties are known to have unique whoops. So there's kind of a continuous thing here. Potentially, it seems leopards should be able to follow this same trend. So this is what we've got here. In amongst this 75,000 hours worth of data, which is a bit overwhelming to consider, I started to look in data which we had camera trap images of. So here is 3 examples of a leopard walking past our cameras, and then the concurrent audio data. And what we got really lucky about is that the leopards were roaring at the same time as when they were walking past the cameras. And so this is a little example of 3 different individuals. Who needs Kruger, eh? So we can already start to hear that there's some slight differences here. And so this is what we started with. We can see as well that there's an in-breath and an out-breath vocalization which produces this iconic soaring roar that leopards have. And the focus of this vocal identification is the out-breath vocalization, which is more pronounced. It's the second part. So what we did is that we took these fundamental frequencies, we got their X and Y values, so time and frequency, and then we created things called hidden Markov models. Now, hidden Markov models, for those who don't know, allow you to essentially have points in time and to look at how most likely you go from one point to the next. They're used a lot in accelerometer data to categorize behavior. So we built 7 hidden Markov models because that's the number of leopards that we had data for. And then we left one of the bouts out each time. So this was a leave one out cross-validation. And what we looked at is we looked at a log likelihood score of saying, this is our test bout. Which of our 7 models do you think it's most likely to be associated to? And because our leopard roar, so this is the mean leopard roar for each of our 7 leopards, was, well, hopefully you can start to see that they look a bit different. We were quite hopeful that this would indicate a successful ability to discriminate between individuals. And this is what this confusion matrix is basically showing. The nice diagonal line would indicate that things have gone pretty well, on the most part. And so this is the case, so that we had an overall accuracy of 93%, and an overall F1 score of 0.78. Our F1 scores did vary between individual. I would have a guess that that's probably because of, in certain individuals, there was greater intra-individual variation in the vocalizations. More data may facilitate more obvious differences, but that's just a hypothesis. So what can we do from this? So we've essentially said leopards have unique roars, albeit from quite a small data set. Well, potentially, they could now be a target species for acoustic monitoring surveys, density estimates, spatiotemporal tracking, or home range analysis. But what's also quite interesting is that paired technology potentially facilitates the discovery, in inverted commas, of novel species traits, which is really important when we're potentially wanting to more holistically monitor a landscape. By deploying technology which records complementary data, we can now start to think about how we're recording data and how we can use different types of data to better understand the landscapes that we work in. That's not me. Interesting. And essentially what we can suggest is that these dual tech studies will potentially help us monitor more efficiently than single tech alone, which I think is a really important thing to finish on. We are in an ecological and climate crisis. There is limited conservation funds, as I'm sure we're all aware, as we scramble over each other trying to battle for grants. So it's imperative that we monitor in the most efficient way. And this can only be done if we are innovative and creative and collaborative. And so that's kind of what I hope that we can continue to do, to try and be the next generation to, well, hopefully change things. It's at least what I'm hoping to do from this. I'd like to say thank you to my supervisors and co-authors. In particular, massive thanks for my research assistants, Kachira and Joseph. Without them, this wouldn't have been possible at all. Funding bodies, of course. And any questions? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that talk. If anybody has questions for Jonathan, you can go ahead.
Thanks, Jonathan. That was fascinating. I was wondering what proportion of the 7 leopards that you had were males and females, and if you had photos of leopards that you didn't have calls from and calls of photos that you didn't have leopards from. Basically, do females call as reliably as males?
So the sex split was 5 and 2, so 5 males and 2 females. So there was a little bit of a split. In terms of how many, so there was, I can't remember the exact number so we identified all of the individuals from the camera trap images. It was between 30 and 40, can't remember the exact number off the top of my head. But within a third of all camera trap capture events, there was concurrent leopards roaring. The problem we had is that for this to have worked, we had to have multiple instances of them roaring so that we could take a test spout and compare it to the training that we built a model on, if that makes sense. So it was a third of all total images, there was leopards roaring. There was a 5-2 split from the 7 that we were able to use, but there was a further 5 individuals that were roaring alongside camera trap images that we couldn't use the data of for a variety of reasons, if that helps.
Yeah, that helps a lot. Thanks so much.
We have one question online.
There's a question from Catherine online. She says, what strategy do you have to find vocalizations that don't occur with detections on cameras?
Yeah, so that's a really important bit, and is the kind of one of the next stages, is starting to do this thing called out-of-set classification. So at the minute, what we have is that we have a scene data set. So it's all labeled, but what happens if we want to say, well, I have this leopard roar, but it's not from a known individual. How do we start to take this into account? So there are likelihood scores that we want to implement to start to determine whether our models can say, yes, this is a known leopard and this isn't. So that's the next step, is to understand how out-of-set classification could be implemented, but we're not there yet. This is, as ever with bioacoustics, this is the very basic level, and now we'll start to go further into this and try and work harder.
Okay, Simon, only if it's quick, eh?
But if you have localized with GPS timed microphones, you can localize, so you don't actually need to assign individuality to calls. You can just use acoustic spatial capture recapture.
So that would work.
But it is interesting. Sorry.
That's all right. So that would work, yeah, completely if you were able to capture your leopards on 3 or more devices. So the spacing of this was at 2.5 kilometers difference. I'd say leopard calls probably propagate, well, in this landscape under this survey, was most likely propagating about 1.5 kilometers. So we weren't getting that reliable pickup of signal on multiple devices to enable localization.
Okay, thank you so much.
Cheers.